Yeah, I can.
All right, sweet. All right, round two. I
Yeah,
checked
pretty
I
much.
checked the stream and the stream could hear me for some reason, but I guess on Discord you couldn't hear me. So who knows what was going on there? Hi, Mango.
Uh,
We had a few technical difficulties, and we're getting ready to Well, I just restarted the stream, so we'll probably take questions later on if you want to stick around. Um, Anyways, let me reintroduce. I guess we're back at the Tao of Talk on Jeet Kune Show with Herakles now. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties with Discord, which is usual. So apologies. Um, I think there was useful stuff said on the other one, but I'll check, and if not, I'll just end up probably canning that stream, and this will be the new one. Um, if not, I want to repeat some stuff because I want to make sure it gets heard that I appreciate Heracles for all the efforts that he makes here with me. I think I said before on the other one that it's amazing that someone can spend one session talking with me, let alone how many that he and I have spent together, and including going live here. So I really appreciate you being here with me, Heracles, and making this effort. This is pretty awesome of you. So thank you.
Well, I thank you instead because you have given me an opportunity to speak. And secondly, I do not believe that I am worthy of such respect, but I thank you nevertheless. Thank you for the compliment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you are. So, but anyways, we'll go into the topic now, I guess, if you're ready. That is.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to just quick intro yourself again, just to make sure people know who you are?
So I'm Herakles. I'm a student of psychology. I'm currently pursuing my post-graduation in psychology, and I'm quite interested in philosophy as well, amongst other things. So this is a topic that I am about to discuss, narcissism.
Mm.
So
Um, Awesome. So I think you said before this is a topic you're kind of currently on too. Is that right?
yeah, yeah, that's right. I've been studying personality disorders, and one of which is indeed narcissism. So I study narcissistic personality disorder. So I've been getting into it right now in my syllabus as well. So I've been attending lectures about it. I'm somewhat curious about it as well because I like personality disorders. So they are, in a way, very different from other disorders because these are not necessarily about a particular behavior, but patterns of behavior that persist from the very childhood of that being. So it really is different from some other disorders. So I'd like to get into how narcissism is a thing. First of all, it's a trait, and it is also a philosophy, and it is also a part of the dark triad. It is also a personality disorder. So there's a lot to cover here. Let's see how long we could end up doing this. So let's see.
Mm. Well, we don't have to cover it all in one session. We could do multiples. We could cover multiple facets of psychology. I love psychology. Again, I'm an armchair warrior, so you're the one with the credentials here. So correct me in anything that I say, anything that I could, feel free, because I'm the dimwit here. Um, is this something you chose to study, or is this just part of your curriculum, or um, you were interested because you like personality disorders, so you did, what's the impetus behind narcissism right now for you?
Well, I did not choose to study it right now in my syllabus. It's a part of the syllabus. It's part of the syllabus for all students who study psychology. But it is some of those things that have influenced me in my life. So even earlier in my life, I was always fascinated by personality disorders, and particularly narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. So this is something that I find very interesting, and this is something I have a keen interest in. So as I said, this is not only a subject to me, it is something much deeper than that. It is something that I have been interested in because I have had my encounters with narcissists. So I've had my interactions and I have always wondered why these people happen to be the way they are. So yeah,
Hmm.
it was more than that.
Do you think you've learned? Anything as to why they are the way they are?
Oh, probably not. How is a better question now to be asked, but at the
Mm,
time it is what it is. So yeah, yeah,
interesting. Mm. Well, so we talked about covering like the etymology of the word, or the history of the word, or the
Mhm.
phenomenon, the behavioral phenomenon. So where do you want to
Yeah,
start?
that's
Where
good.
how did you like to
Yeah,
start?
I'd start with the story of Narcissus, the mythological story in the Greek mythology. So I'll start with there because that's how the word came about. So there's this story in Greek mythology or Greek religion, perhaps, and the idea is simple. So there was this guy called Narcissus, and Narcissus was extremely handsome. So he was so handsome that everybody was attracted to him, all genders, everybody. People were so attracted to him, he grew very, very arrogant. So arrogant, as a matter of fact, that he would be misbehave with everybody, right? So the idea was that he was cursed by the goddess of vengeance in Greek mythology, that he'd have to suffer because he made somebody suffer in the past. So, and then he went near a pond and he saw his own reflection in the pond. And as soon as he
Grew
did
very,
so,
very arrogant.
he fell in love with himself. And as soon as he fell in love with himself, he wanted to hug himself. And as he tried to, he realized that was all water. So it ultimately rendered him in depression. That is the story of narcissism, and that's how the word came about, so to speak. Now, this story is not necessarily reflective of the modern disorder in any sense of the word, but I think it is crucial enough to be told. That's why I got into it first. And it also represents narcissism to some degree because narcissistic people are actually in love with themselves to some degree, but they usually are not in love with themselves in such manners, but they are still in love with themselves and think of themselves as superior to others. So to that extent, the story does align with the disorder. Of course, the idea of falling in love with yourself to the degree that you finally just want to get yourself and you can't get yourself, that sort of a thing is probably not true for narcissists. But still, the story is relevant nevertheless. Yeah.
Mm, mm. So it's interesting to think back. Like, I wonder if they thought of these things as malignant traits back, like, characterized as things that just happen, or if they saw some of the behavioral experiences that cause these types of behaviors. I don't think we have history that really goes that far back that would explain that really well. Do you?
Yeah, that's of course. So you could get into the Greek perspective on such stories, and by the time of Aristotle, people in majority looked down upon narcissism and arrogance. So it is pretty clear that they did not like a narcissist for the most part, right?
Hmm,
So
hmm,
this isn't something that was admired in the story, and I'm pretty sure they looked up or down upon it at the time because you could, look into the writings of Aristotle and you'd find that there is such emphasis on traits that would describe the modern day narcissist, and and usually the emphasis is negative, right? They are usually described as something evil. Now
hmm,
that might not necessarily be the same as we do today. They did not necessarily look at it like a pathology, but at the same time, they did dislike such traits. So that's important to acknowledge.
hmm,
Yeah.
hmm, hmm, hmm,
Now, I can't tell you about the beginning of the mythology, though. At that time, there's probably not any written records to speak of.
hmm.
You never
Yeah,
know.
I think I read it was like the 8th century or something, written. I forget the name of the character. I was just reading off some Wikipedia stuff. Um, so do you? I guess is part of. I'd have to imagine part of your tool here is the DSM, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The
Is that?
DSM as well as the ICD. But yeah.
Okay? So I don't know what the ICD is. Could you explain that?
It's the International Classification of Diseases. This is often used by doctors, but there is a particular manual within the ICD for mental disorders and neurodevelopmental disorders, and that also covers the topics of such disorders as well. So, yeah.
Interesting. I'll have to look into that. I've never heard of the ICD. So I guess that's like each country kind of has its own internal standards, and then this is like an international standard, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is
Hmm.
technically an international standard, absolutely.
how that's interesting. Like I could go down on that, but that's not really narcissism particularly. So
Yeah,
what are the classic narcissistic traits that we're talking about here? When we're
the
when
classic narcissistic. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, it's okay. Take over.
Okay. So the classic narcissistic trait, so the utmost narcissistic trait is indeed grandiose sense of self-importance. This is the first trait within the DSM. And the idea is that this person thinks of themselves as absolutely superior to everybody and the most important person in the world. And that's true more often than not. If you look at a narcissist, one of the defining characteristics of that individual is that he seems to think that he's better than everybody else.
Mm.
He's so superior to others that he doesn't need to listen to them, and all other people are stupid and not worth his time, or probably do not give him his due share. So he believes himself to be so superior that everybody else is nothing but probably an idiot before him. That sort of a thought process is common across the board for a narcissist.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
So
this turns into a pathology often. Yeah, go ahead.
no, it's okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to fill in space. If you got stuff to say, say it. You're the authority here.
No, 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 that's not fair. And so the pathology that often emerges out of such behaviors is that you meet other people, but you do not acknowledge them as human beings. You see them something inferior. You look upon them as humans often look upon animals. So you think of them as something not worth your time, not worth your respect, not worth your interest. So you often just look down upon people. You want to command them. You want to essentially order them around as much as possible. You want to control them as much as possible.
Oh, I lost you.
Hmm?
I lost your voice there
Hello?
at the end. Yeah, I think you're back now.
Okay. So if you look down upon people to the degree that you can no longer trust them, that you can no longer have them do their own thing, and you have to command them every second of the day, you have to micromanage them. At that point, you become a dysfunctional part of society, and that's the main problem with narcissism. People could have varying beliefs, it's fine, but you could get with those beliefs to a degree that now you can no longer really function in a society, at least not optimally. So
Mm.
that's very important about narcissism. If we speak from the perspective of DSM,
Mm.
grandiose sense of self-importance is the most important part of the narcissistic personality disorder.
Are there other areas of the spectrum that don't weigh as heavily on that particular trait? Like, isn't it generally like a set of traits, and then if you have these sets of traits, how exacerbated each one of these traits are is kind of like how someone would go through a diagnosis. Um, is that accurate, or am I speaking wrong?
That's absolutely accurate. Yes. There are actually quite a few symptoms mentioned in the TSM, and you have to have five symptoms amongst them, right? You have to have at least five of them, right?
Mm.
And of course, there are other traits that could be exaggerated, and this trait might not necessarily be present. But that's extremely rare because this is the foundation of other traits, right? So other symptoms can only emerge out of this trait. For instance, let me take an example of another trait that is believes that they are superior or unique. So this is one of the symptoms that's mentioned. Believes that they are unique or special, right? Now, in order to believe that you are unique and special, you have to have some high level of self-importance as well. So these are connected traits. You cannot have it independently of the other. It's very difficult to have it. You could have it, but it's unlikely, very unlikely, so to speak, right? And there are other traits like, for instance, has a sense of entitlement. But for
Mm.
instance, sense of entitlement might exist independently of the first trait, absolutely. But the truth of the matter is that in most cases, if not all, probably not all, but in most cases, you'd find the first trait, grandiose sense of self-importance, the idea that they are so important that everybody should care about them.
Mm.
This is the defining characteristic in that sense. Of
Mm.
course, there are other traits, and this could be absent in some unique cases, but more often than not, this is indeed the defining characteristic of
Mm.
the disorder, so to speak.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you've had experience with people that are at that and I don't want to talk about any people in particular, but how frequently do you encounter people with that you would think these people are, on the malignant spectrum? You said you don't understand why they do the things that they do. Maybe maybe you're coming to more light about why their or how their behaviors emerge. What are the, experiences that uh, I believe I've read that there is some hereditary notion. There's like a minor little bit of hereditary, positive hereditary notion in narcissism. Most of it is behavioral through like environment experiences. So how often do you encounter it? Like how is this giving you a reflection on your daily life, I guess?
Okay, that's true. So I've had encountered many narcissists. I couldn't necessarily say I've encountered the most narcissistic people out there, but I have encountered some that would definitely fall on the spectrum that could easily be diagnosed with the disorder.
Mm,
And the interaction with them is very problematic because when you speak to them, they always showcase their superiority over you. They try to somehow make you feel humbled. They want to humble you, right? They want to humiliate you in any way, shape, or form, right? And whenever they get the opportunity to do so, they do not spare the opportunity whatsoever. So when you, even as a therapist, when you're interacting with such a person, they often do not come because they want to have their problem solved. They come and they ask, tell you what, you know what they say to most therapists? No, I'm here to check whether you are a good therapist or not. I'm not ill. I'm not sick. It's nothing
mm,
about me. I'm just here to check whether you're actually somebody worthwhile to speak to. So this is the kind of interaction you'd have with many people who come there. They're like, I'm just here to check you. I'm just here to test you. Are you good enough? Are you enough of a therapist to be here? Are you good
mm,
enough to diagnose me? Are you good enough to tell that I am not ill? That's the question they'd come and ask you. And this is the kind of interaction that you have in a therapeutic session. And
mm,
now in a professional session, this might be very different. So for instance, if you're in a profession, if you're in a job, this could often come across very differently, right? There might be people who just want to make you feel humbled, as I said. So they will deliberately, tell you that you are just not good enough, that you don't know how to do things, that you should just listen to them all the time and every time. They are deliberately overbearing, and it's difficult to deal with. It's extremely difficult to deal with. It could be traumatic for some people. So now there are some narcissists who are not necessarily as obvious as others. Some of them are not as, how do I describe it, as explicit as others, right? So these people often do different things. So they wouldn't necessarily tell you that they feel superior to you. They would actually be quite cunning in that moment. What they'll do is that they will deliberately disparage you behind your back. They'll deliberately try to bring you down, but right before you, they would not necessarily show you that they're narcissistic. This is
mm,
a more so of a implicit narcissist, and these kinds of people are usually much more difficult to deal with because you can't even tell that they are narcissists. But if you actually look into their self-esteem, it's obviously through the roof, right? And this is one of the things, right? And I think Jordan Peterson mentioned this a long time ago that self esteem might be a pathological trait. This idea probably emanates from the notion that uh, higher self esteem is often observed in bullies and narcissistic people. So, is this always true? No. Many people who happen to have high self esteem are not necessarily pathological, right? So, this is not a categorization that I would necessarily agree to, but this is a categorization that many people have thought about, many people have conjectured, because the notion is that if you have very high self-esteem, there is this obvious conclusion that comes along with it. The idea that you are so good, you might also come to think that others are inferior to you. So
mm,
the problem isn't that you think of yourself as better. The problem is that you also think that others are not good enough. Now,
mm,
when these two traits are combined, and then you have something according to the narcissistic personality disorder, but not necessarily, because in order to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, there are certain other things that you have to take into account. But still,
mm, mm. Man, I have so many questions, and I could go so many different directions. I want to revisit because a lot of what you just said reminded me of when I was reading that like narcissism is on a scale, and essentially, I mean, correct me if any of this is wrong, but basically it could be on a healthy scale of like self-confidence, you know, but it can go malignant to where now you're at this person who is, I'm the most important, everybody's less than me, or I'm so important, like you said, you undercut people to make them less because You know, um, so is that true? Is I mean, I guess technically you wouldn't call a healthy self-confidence narcissism, but you could consider it like the lowest possible on the scale. Is that accurate?
Okay, so that's a good question. I mean, there are certain scales that have, normal levels of self-esteem and higher levels of self-esteem to the degree that it might be pathological, right? So now these scales do make a claim that narcissism is indeed on a spectrum, and you could make an argument that people who happen to have lower levels of narcissism are nothing but nobody's except essentially self-confident, right? Very self-confident about themselves. But this is a questionable claim. I understand that this claim exists for a reason, but I do not happen to agree with such a claim for a
Hmm.
simple reason, right? As I just pointed out, and this is something that I just said, when you think of narcissism, right? When you think of narcissism, what's the characteristic thing you think about? You don't necessarily think of high self-esteem, although that's a part of it, right? You think of a person who wants to be superior to others. This is the characteristic narcissist, right? If you're talking about pathological narcissist, so they have another tendency. They think of themselves as superior, right? This is important because if you do not have it, then you probably cannot be diagnosed with the DSM criteria, right? You cannot be diagnosed. It's not easy. Let me tell you the criteria right now, right? So first of all, so these are the symptoms, and I need to emphasize this grandiose sense of self-importance, right? This is the first one. I already spoke about it. The
Hmm.
second is the preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. The idea that you could have fantasies about all those things, being ultimately successful, ultimately powerful, ultimately brilliant, ultimately beautiful, or something to the extreme. It doesn't really matter, but some sort of an exaggerated sense of goals, right? And believes they are special and unique. I spoke about this. Requires excessive admiration. They want you to admire them. It's not only about being confident, it's also about wanting to be confirmed, right? They want you to affirm their superiority. If you do not affirm their superiority, that's a problem because
Hmm.
now their uh, their real self and their ideal self is in a conflict, and that's not something acceptable to them because to them their real self is their ideal self. There's no gap there, and if there's no gap, you should affirm that, and if you do not affirm that, that's a problem, right? So has a sense of entitlement because they think they are already worthy of everything. Why do they not get it? Why does
Hmm.
this person happen to have more than I do? That's a problem, right? Why do I not happen to own everything in the world? That's a problem because you are everything in this world. And interpersonally exploitative, right? So this idea that I could take advantage of you if given the opportunity because I'm better than you. I have this is my right. I'm just superior to you, so I have the right to exploit you. That sort of a notion, right? Lacks empathy. They often do not show his empathy, probably not in the sense of the antisocial person, because an antisocial person often does not display empathy because there are multiple types of antisocial personality disorder. But for a psychopath, they often do not display empathy because they do not have the right neurochemical structure for it. Often they have certain sort of an impairment in their prefrontal cortex that prevents them from having empathy. So that's more of a biological problem. But in this case, it's not necessarily as biological as the other because in this case, it's not that they do not acknowledge your existence. They just happen to think of you as an object or enemy. They just don't think
Hmm.
you're human enough for them. So that's the problem. They just do not think you are on their level. And for instance, how many humans care about ants being crushed under? Nobody. Most humans do not care if some ants are crushed under their feet. Nobody cares about it. That's how they think of you. It's not that they cannot feel empathy, just they do not even think of you in the same category. That's the problem. Right. So often envious of others and believes others are envious of them. So they think that, okay, they want something that you have, and they also believe that other people are looking at them and trying to take what's theirs. That's another problem, right? Arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitudes, right? So they have this arrogant behaviors, right? So the idea is that they cannot possibly take this into account and they cannot possibly accept that somebody is superior to them. They'll try to show you that they are better. So in that case, they'll display arrogant behaviors, right? Like they'll tell you on, right before you that, you know what, you're so stupid. Why are you here? You shouldn't even be in the same office as I am. What in the world are you doing here? You're not worthy of it. You should be on the streets begging for food, something of the sort. And they'll tell you that. That's the problem. They'll come and tell you that more often than not. And it's a ridiculous thing to do, but they do not have a shared sense of empathy that you do, because they do not think that you belong in the same category as they do. So now, once I mention all these symptoms, you might realize that in order to have these symptoms, right, for instance, like excessive admiration, could you imagine a self-confident person seeking excessive admiration? Probably not. They're confident enough not to want your admiration, right? Another one has a sense of entitlement. If they're confident enough, they could go get it themselves. Interpersonally exploitative. They're confident enough, they don't want to take it from you, right? So this is the notion, right? And if they're confident enough, they probably are also, they should also be humble enough to realize that this preoccupation with fantasies of ultimate success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love is probably untenable. It's not something that you could do.
Mm,
It's impossible. But
mm,
they think that it's possible. Now, does this often help them? You know what? It actually does. Many people happen to be narcissists. It's a problem. Many people in power happen to be narcissists because they believe that they are good enough to get there, so they actually get there. That's a problem. But this is the problem, because many people who might have the skills, might have the abilities, might not have the confidence to be there. But that's not a problem for a narcissist, because they happen to have as much confidence as possible. But this is a problem that you encounter with these narcissists. Now, this is, of course, the DSM criteria that I speak of. You could take a different definition of narcissism. In that case, you could argue that, of course, there is this pathological level of narcissism and non-pathological level of narcissism. But from the perspective of DSM, and if you're taking into account the symptoms in the DSM, I think it's not fair to suggest that you could somehow have narcissism and still be non-pathological, at least
mm.
not without treatment, right?
So this
So
might be the
yeah,
notion where people use the word colloquially. You know, they don't necessarily know, but somebody is displaying some sort of behavior that seems sort of selfish or self-centered, or they're showing some sort of dominant behavior or something, and they're just colloquially throwing the term around narcissist, you know, with someone who may not be pathological, I guess, because if it takes five characteristics and not just necessarily, I guess it would be a pattern of behavior that would lead to some sort of need, damage that would lead to some sort of need to diagnosis. Diagnosis would lead to, saying, oh yeah, you're a narcissist by these qualities. Um, so I guess that's kind of the distinction made there is pathological. Is every pathological narcissist on the NPD within NPD? Do you understand that question? Like if you're pathological, are you narcissistic personality disorder, or are there non-NPD pathologies? Does that make sense?
non-NPD pathologies that are also associated with narcissism, is that the question?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so in the DSM, probably not, but
Mm,
in ICD, there's another personality disorder category. So in that case, yes, right. So So when you get into the DSM, the problem is that you have certain other disorders that happen to have certain similarities, but they do not use the term narcissism in that scenario. For instance, antisocial personality disorder could also have high or inflated self or inflated ego, something of the sort. But
mm,
in that case, that's very different, because there the emergence is very different. And then, of course, there's an exception though. There's something that I'd like to get into right now. So and there's the idea of personality disorder, and it's important to emphasize that personality disorders do not happen as a result of some sort of a harm. For instance, there might be a person who got injured, like in their head, some sort of a brain traumatic injury to their brain, and they might have a personality change. This is not a personality disorder, and they might start portraying symptoms similar to a narcissist. In that case, they will not be diagnosed with narcissistic personality
mm.
disorder. For you to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, you need to have these symptoms before 18, as a matter of fact. You cannot develop them in your late adulthood or in your early adulthood.
Ooh,
You should
interesting.
have them before 18, usually in your childhood or in your adolescence. In early adolescence, you should portray such symptoms. And if you do not, you cannot be diagnosed with the disorder. It's
Mm,
usually categorized as a personality change instead if it happens much later in their lives.
interesting.
Yeah.
So then, all right, that raises a lot of questions for me. Like, it's still? I guess it's still behavioral, right? So is it still
Yeah.
associated with mostly like their experiences? Where, I mean, I also read, and let's bring this in here, that there's another spectrum of things that cause narcissistic behaviors, which is like either over coddling of parenting who, overly care for them, give them too much, to the other end of the spectrum of neglect. Like neglect can also cause, or not cause, but you know, be lead kind of lead to narcissistic.
Conducive to,
Yeah,
conducive
is
to.
that right or no?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. The etiology of the disorder is quite complicated. There is a partial genetic element to it, but the behavioral element to it, or something pertaining to upbringing of the individual. The problem is that, for instance, let's take the example of over cuddling, or being over caring about your children. So you affirm their arrogance. You tell them, yeah, you are the best in the world. You give them everything they ask for. You make them you make them feel like kings or queens, right? You treat them like that. And at that point, what ends up happening is that you are affirming all of their pathological beliefs to no end. You are conditioning them in such a manner, right? This is an example of operant conditioning. You are rewarding their pathological behaviors.
Mm,
You're rewarding them. You keep on rewarding their pathological behaviors, ultimately conditioning them to behave in such a manner. And that often also rewards their cognitions. And this is a long trend, but what ends up happening is that develop cognitions pertaining to narcissism. And as soon as that happens, now it becomes very difficult to take it out. So now they have such beliefs. The parents are always there for them. The parents always affirm whatever they do, wherever they do. At this point, the person cannot possibly think that there could be anything wrong with them. They just think that everybody else is stupid if they do not, like them, or if they do not necessarily want to speak to them. Right? They just don't even think that they could be wrong. Now, there's the opposite example that you speak of, the idea that you might not have any parenting love, any parental love. You might have nothing. You might have been treated indifferently. Nobody cares about you. Nobody cares about you. Or possibly, much worse, you have been ridiculed all your life, right? You have been told you are nobody. You are nothing. You can do nothing. You are incapable. You are incompetent. You are impotent. You are just nothing. You are just a disgrace to the parents, right? That's what you have been told. So now this keeps on happening, this keeps on happening, this keeps on happening to you. So you have to somehow survive. So there's this defense mechanism in which you finally develop the completely opposite belief that you are the best. Because these people, they do not know anything. Because at that point, it becomes so uncomfortable for you to be there. It's absolutely uncomfortable. Imagine that you are sitting there and somebody is telling you that you're stupid, and that's your own parents. These are the people that you have been interacting with the most. And they keep on telling you are so bad, you're so terrible, you're so evil, or whatever. And they keep on telling you that, but you realize that you have something good to say as well, that you are somebody as well. Because now there's this problem that these people are saying something and you are saying something else altogether. You believe something else. So now you have to somehow counter their belief. And in this attempt to counter, you develop the exact opposite beliefs that you are the best. You are the most extraordinary person on the planet. There's nobody like you. There's nobody as skillful as you. There's nobody as intelligent as you. There's nobody as clever as you. And this is the kind of belief that you could develop because now you are trying to counter their aggressions, perhaps, their arguments, their words. You're trying to counter them. And in that attempt, you might succeed to some degree because now you have realized that, okay, these people just do not care. They'll just criticize you no matter what. At that point, you develop completely the opposite belief because that's how you survive. Because you
mm,
cannot possibly live with the belief that you are nobody, you are absolutely a disgrace, because this belief is so disheartening, so depressing, that people often develop the exact opposite belief in order to persevere in their lives. This is a problem, but this happens, yeah.
mm, mm. So we've got a couple questions outstanding. I want to jump in here. One is online here on YouTube. It says, "So does trauma play a part in becoming a narcissist?" And I mean, I'd like to take just a quick stab at that and say even those spectrum of behaviors that you're talking about there, I think could technically be considered forms of trauma. But are there particular like traumas that I mean, what's the spectrum of trauma that could lead to is there any is there any credence to what I just said that trauma it could be neglect could be that trauma, or an over affirming parent could be a form of trauma because of the, what it leads to? I mean, how does trauma relate here?
Okay, trauma. So, of course, trauma. So it really depends on how you're looking at trauma. it is usually not physical trauma that happens in this scenario. It's not usually a result of physical trauma that you happen to have a narcissistic personality disorder, although it could be a part of it. But more often than not, it's often about the expectations of their parents as well. So there's this trend often seen that in individualistic cultures, narcissism is more common. Narcissistic personality disorder happens to be more common in individualistic cultures
Mm.
or cultures more oriented towards personal achievement, right? Especially, for instance, like take a look at Asia, right? In South Korea, many parents want their children to become the best version of themselves, want to compete and want them to become engineers, doctors. Same is true for China, same is true for India, same is true for many parts of Asia. And in these cultures, this could be traumatic for a child because a child might not want to do all of those things. A child might never want to be a doctor, never want to be an engineer, but he's forced into that. Not only is being forced into that, he's made to compete with thousands of people who are passionate about it. So he's made to compete with those people who actually care about the subject, who care about all these things. And this is extremely traumatic. And if he fails, he's disregarded, he's criticized, he's ridiculed, or he might even be beaten up, right? So this kind of expectations, these kinds of expectations might lead to completely different beliefs. But now think, there's this child, you have this child, and this child, you expect him to perform at his very best, and he doesn't do so well in school for probably any reason, but he doesn't do so well in his school, and you keep on criticizing him because he's your child and you want him to do the best. So you tell him, you're stupid, can't you get an A? You're so stupid. What's wrong with you? Why are you so lazy? Why are you always sitting in your chair? What's wrong with you? Just get lost. So that's the treatment they get. And this criticism keeps on happening, keeps on happening, keeps on happening. That in of itself is very traumatic for the child. Because the child feels depressed, because the child probably doesn't know what's wrong with him. He might think that he's stupid. And if that happens, that's a problem. That's a pathology in of itself. But if that does not happen, and the child somehow develops a defense mechanism to counter all this, right? He develops reaction formation, right? This kind of a thing. So reaction formation is this idea that a child might develop exactly the opposite of the belief, right? So it's okay. So I'm missing the point here. So the child reaction formation is the idea that a person might have a belief, right? So let's say that a person is homosexual, right? And now that person is so the person feels attraction towards males, let's say, and now that person becomes a homophobe. He becomes homophobic because he has homosexual tendencies. This is an example of reaction formation. In this case, what ends up happening is that this child is going through all this. He's suffering and he thinks he's stupid. He thinks he's not good enough. So as a result, he has reaction formation. So he develops the exact opposite belief that I just spoke of. The idea that he's the best, he's extraordinary. This is the defense mechanism, reaction formation. That's what happens. And once that happens, that's traumatic for the child. Imagine that you have been told that you are nobody, you are nothing, you have been criticized all your life, but yeah, and you probably are beaten up because you're not good enough. That leads to these problems. And yeah, so this is, of course, trauma plays a role, but is trauma, is, if you're talking about physical trauma, not necessarily.
Right. Yeah.
More so
Yeah.
mental trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the physical trauma would represent what you talked about earlier. Like if somebody has physical damage to their brain, that's not a
Hmm.
pathological narcissist, right? That's someone who has damage to their brain.
Yeah,
Essentially.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. They may display
yeah,
some of the same qualities, but
yeah.
yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah. So I guess it would define it. Yeah. So we have another, actually, that I wanted to call out. That was Rashitialo on YouTube. Thank you for the question. Also, we have Anas here who has a question from Discord. What is the hidden line between self-confidence and narcissistic behavior? Maybe we kind of covered that a little bit. I mean, pathology, I would assume, right? Diagnosable characteristics, traits, behaviors,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm. Primarily, yes. And if I were to answer that briefly, the main difference is that a self-confident person believes that he can do everything, but a narcissistic person believes that he can do everything better than everybody else.
Mm, mm. So what would be on the spectrum of, is there something on the spectrum that would be considered like maybe completely counterintuitive to narcissism? Who would be the opposite spectrum of narcissism? Is there such a notion?
There are certain disorders that might be seen as exactly the opposite, absolutely. But these disorders are not necessarily as I couldn't necessarily call them the antithesis to narcissism. They are the sort of like avoidant personality disorders or
Mm,
certain attachment tendencies that might be described as the opposite. But I
mm,
don't think there's something categorically antithetical to nas, so
mm.
to speak.
Yeah, avoidant is
Yeah,
interesting. So I think you said earlier envy is a big part of narcissism, right?
absolutely.
Is that I mean, I
Yeah.
think I heard Paul Conti talk about envy being like the primary characteristic that emerges the classical traits. So when you see the classical traits, you're seeing the horrible behaviors that they do because they're narcissistic, but it's this deep desire to want appreciation, to want attention, to want to be the most important, to have everything, to so this all kind of resorts down to envy. Does that make sense or
Yes, it does. It does. It does. So, absolutely, envy is a part of it because for a narcissist, it's not always about being the best, it's about being better than others. He doesn't care to be the best. He cares to be better than others. That's the main thing. It might not seem different, but it is. So it's not like he wants to be the best. He wants to be better than others. Not only that, he believes that he's so good enough that he could overcome any hurdle in his path. This is the thing that a narcissist often believes. So what ends up happening is that imagine you are the best at something. Let's say that you are best at painting a particular way. But if people do not acknowledge you, that's not good enough for you. Was there somebody being more acknowledged at another point for something else? It doesn't matter what it is, but somebody else being acknowledged. And you're not being acknowledged simply because just because you are good enough, that's not good enough. That's the problem because you're good enough to be the best at something. That's not good enough for you because you want admiration. Not only that you want to be best, you want to be recognized as best. And that's the part of narcissism, right? This is a clear distinction between narcissism and self confidence. Self-confident person might not want to be recognized as the best, not necessarily. But a narcissist wants to be recognized as best. And he has no humility to recognize that he might be wrong. For instance, he could never acknowledge that he is wrong. A self-confident person could come up and tell you, you know what? You are right and I am wrong. I'm here to correct my beliefs. I'm here to correct my methods. Here to correct my errors. A narcissist would never come up to you. As a matter of fact, he might never think about the fact that he could be wrong. He might come up with as many delusions as possible just in order to deny that he is wrong. He might become delusional just to deny that he is wrong. He could never come to accept that he could be wrong. That's an impossible thought to him. Completely impossible. Somebody else must be in the wrong if he is wrong. If he's saying something, it must be right.
hmm, hmm,
It has to be right because he's a narcissist and he thinks he's the best. So this kind of an idea is important. Envy is a part of it because if you are the best, if you genuinely believe that you are the best and you deserve all the attention that there is in the world, then if somebody else is getting it, they are taking that away from you because you are the one who should have gotten all the love, all the admiration, all the desires. You should have been the one, but you are not the one. That means that what you believe is at odds with what's happening to you. How could this possibly be? There's only one explanation. All other people on the planet are stupid. So that's the only explanation that they could come up with. So yeah. Uh,
maybe I'm a narcissist. I don't know. I'm just kidding. Um, so are you familiar with the term generative drive? Have you ever heard that term before?
Generative drive. I don't think so.
Hmm.
What is it?
I don't know. What's coming up in my head is like to keep reversing this down. Like if it comes from envy, what is envy? Envy is kind of like desire for things. It's like an over emphasis on desire for things. And then what drives humans? I've heard this term generative drive. It's like you, biological creatures have this need to do things, if you will. It seems like, not only am I alive, but of course, there's the rudiments. I need to drink, I need to eat, I need, the biological sustenance. And then
Okay.
beyond that, we have, so I'm wondering, just where psychology sits as far as how deep, like where's the disconnect between psychology and this is another important thing. I think heard you mention recently that you're also studying neurology or neurobiology.
Yeah, partially, yes.
So I guess what I'm trying to do is how close to, like, close is not a good answer. I know we're nowhere close to bridging the gap between human behavior and how it emerges from the physical phenomenon. But how does psychology look at the roots of behaviors of, like, where envy comes from a root perspective, or is that more of a neurobiological function direction to go towards? Do you understand the question?
See, I do understand the question. Envy. So if you take a look at it from the perspective of psychology, envy is all about wanting something. It's all about wanting something else, something that anybody else has, right? So now if you want to get into why people have envy, there are multiple perspectives on it, right? There's of course the cognitive perspective on it, that the idea is that you have been taught that you have developed such cognitions through being taught. There's also a modeling perspective on it, is that you have learned it from the society, that you saw people do it, you saw people being envious, so you became envious. That's another example of how you think about this, right? There's also the mimetic perspective on it, right? The mimetic perspective is that there's this idea of mimetic desires, the ideas that you occupy, you happen to have because you want to be better than others, and people whom you see in the same category as you are people you cannot be with, and that's a problem because you want to come out as different. So there are multiple perspectives on it. You could also get into the biology of it, right? Envy, why does it exist? So envy has many elements to it. Something of it, some part of it is indeed survival, right? So it seems to be the case that people who happen to have problems with their amygdala happen to also have higher levels of envy. So this is a correlation that I could tell you of. And I don't know why that is. I don't know the example, I don't know why, but I can tell you. So the thing is that somehow amygdala is associated with envy. Fear is associated with envy. This doesn't make any sense to me because amygdala is often a part of fear, but it's also a part of envy. Why? I do not know, but it is. So there's the biological element to it. So there's of course other forms of problem. So for instance, you could get into the role of serotonin, right? People who happen to have lower levels of serotonin in their brain happen to also have more envy. This is not necessarily true. So there is emerging evidence on this. I wouldn't say that there's conclusive evidence on the idea that lower serotonin is associated with envy, but there's emerging evidence on the idea that lower serotonin might lead to envy because serotonin is the neurotransmitter of satiation or satisfaction. So if you have lower serotonin, what ends up happening is that you're not satisfied. You're not satiated. And if you're not satiated, somebody else must be responsible for it. This kind of a notion could easily pop up in your brain, right? So you could become aggressive, you could become all those things, envious, and everything else in the world. But because at the end of the day, what fuels envy, in my opinion, and my opinion is this is my opinion, not necessarily a psychological perspective, but the idea is that I believe envy is fundamentally rooted in lack of satisfaction. So if you're not satisfied with yourself and your circumstances and everything else, what ends up happening is that you look at others, you see what's happening around you, and you realize, look, I do not have satisfaction, but this person seems to have it. Why does he have satisfaction and I do not have satisfaction? And then you look at what he has, what he physically has, and you think, okay, I need to have that in order to have the satisfaction that he does. That sort of a problem emerges, and I think that's indeed the foundation of envy. But that's my personal opinion on it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. I think the amygdala is considered like the fight or flight organ, right? In a sense of the brain. Does that make sense? It's the kind of the deep-seated emotional.
Hmm.
Does that
Hmm.
sound right?
Yeah, yeah, it does.
So being associated with uncertainty, maybe that's the fear. You know, um, you want to be certain of needing certain things and you're not, so it gives you an overemphasis on wanting to be more. Yeah, it's really interesting to me to think, you know, how all this stuff that's in us, these, these nerves, these axons and dendrites and myelin structures and electromagnetic signals. I think we know of what 250 different neurotransmitters and about 50 different hormones last I checked. And all those combinations of things come together to all these things that somehow elicit behaviors. Um,
Mhm.
it's interesting that serotonin, you said there's low serotonin has a correlation to envy. Is that what you said?
Yeah, there's a study that suggests so.
Mm,
But there's emerging evidence on it. As I said, that there's a study that suggests so, but I wouldn't say that there is a conclusive study to
right,
indicate
sure,
that.
sure,
Probably
sure.
there needs to be a better study on that matter. Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Hmm. And it's interesting me that you said like NPD. I think pathological narcissistic personality disorder, however you want to phrase it. You said if you don't have it or if you're not characterized with it by the age of like 18 or so, 20, late adolescence, I guess, that you generally won't get it. Is that a no, it won't happen, or it does happen occasionally, or you know, is that a hard
Now,
line?
if you had no symptoms before 18, you cannot be diagnosed with the disorder. You cannot be diagnosed with the disorder. In that case, it will be considered a personality change, not a personality disorder.
Mm,
That's how it's classified.
interesting.
So if you happen to have a sudden change of your personality, imagine that you were just okay. You were not arrogant, you were not narcissistic, you had no symptoms of narcissism whatsoever until 18. And one day, somehow, at the age of 25, you suddenly turn into a narcissist. Does that make any sense to you? Probably does not happen. And if it does happen, this probably happens as a result of some sort of a biological change in their brain. And that's probably something we ought to study instead of focusing on the behavioral patterns and how this disorder emerges. So people who do not have those symptoms before 18, you usually do not diagnose them with narcissistic personality disorder. You probably have something else to deal with in that case. Probably something else. It's
Mm,
probably it could be some sort of a traumatic experience that led to similar symptoms. For instance, there could be some sort of a deep-seated trauma that you have to deal with. Probably a person encounters some sort of a traumatic experience, and as a response, they develop certain narcissistic personality traits. But these traits or behaviors are not necessarily indicative of the disorder unless the symptoms appeared before the age of 18. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess I'm trying to figure out the sort of categorization here. I get what I'm hearing is like is narcissistic pathological narcissistic personality disorder, is that, are you considered to have some biological effect too? Or because I'm hearing you say there's, if you're categorized it, it's like you're saying you're just this type of person versus someone who's had some sort of events or experiences in their life who have molded them. And I think you called it a behavioral change versus a behavioral disorder. Is that right?
Personality change
Oh,
versus personality
personality
disorder.
change. Okay. So what is that
Yeah.
distinction? I mean, and is there a same categorization for a narcissist in a personality change versus a personality disorder?
Okay, that's a good question. So first of all, even the narcissistic personality disorder has a biological element to it. Absolutely, it does. There's no doubt about it, right? So one of the things that's often noticed in a in a narcissistic person is that they happen to have problems with their dopamine signaling. There's a dysfunctional dopamine signaling problem in narcissistic personality disorder, and
Mm,
this somehow fuse their reward and punishment understanding, right? So, for instance, they might feel rewarded very quickly. They might feel that, oh, so instance, you praise them and they already feel on the top of their lives, right? They feel, okay, this person told me that I'm the best, I must be the best. And this is probably some problem of dopamine because dopamine is being released so fast in their brain. Something is wrong with their brain in that case. So this is also partly biological. Some people happen to have certain susceptibility, so to speak, right? So they have certain genes, certain biological makeup that could make them susceptible to certain disorders, vulnerable to certain disorders, just like any other personality disorder. So yes, biological element is always there for a narcissist. But of course, there has to be also the right environmental conditions for the disorders to foster, right? For the disorders to foster, whatever disorder it is, you often also need certain environmental conditions, right? Biology in of itself can cause certain disorders, but certain disorders also need environmental conditions that activate the disorder, right? They might have certain susceptibilities or vulnerabilities, but without the right environmental conditions, the disorder might never develop, even if they happen to have the very same genetic makeup, the same neurochemical makeup. It doesn't matter. Certain environmental conditions might be essential to the development of certain disorders. Not for all, but certain disorders. Certain disorders are essentially rooted in biology, so you cannot fix them just because you have the right environment. It's going to
Mm,
happen nevertheless.
mm,
Now you spoke about personality change, right? So, so these disorders that you speak of, so it is technically still a disorder. I'm not saying that it is not, right? But it is often looked at as TBI, traumatic brain injury, for instance. You had a traumatic brain
mm,
injury, and that somehow changed your personality, and you suddenly developed narcissistic first traits, right? You had that. So now in that case, it would be categorized as traumatic brain injury, and the treatment for it is quite different from the treatment that you'd get if you had narcissistic personality disorder. Because now
mm,
the problem is not necessarily that you were born with certain biological propensities that happen to actualize because of the environment, but now the problem is that you were okay, you had everything right, but something happened to you physically, and that rendered you narcissistic. So the treatment has to be very different because the etiology is very different. The
mm.
causation is very different. You do not have the same causes. And also,
Interesting.
the treatment is very different because you probably have other symptoms as well. Because if you had a traumatic brain injury, you probably do not just have personality problems, you probably have other forms of problem as well, probably pertaining to cognition or something else,
Mm,
coordination, or I don't know, it depends on the kind of brain injury that you got. But the treatment is very different if that's the scenario. You have to have uh, no, you have to be cognizant of such problems as well, right? The other problems that come along with it.
mm,
And there's definitely a category of personality change, but it does not necessarily cover the narcissistic personality change per se.
mm. Interesting. I think Kyle is unmuted here. Maybe wanted to ask a question.
I did. I'm wondering if there is any treatment to subdue or even eradicate such narcissistic, destructive behavior.
So are you asking me that could you possibly cure a narcissist? Is that the question?
Can you cure ever or
Yeah,
lessen? Tame the narcissist.
you can only tame the narcissist, you cannot cure it. Not yet, at least. There's no treatment.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
You, you cannot cure any personality disorder whatsoever.
Mm. And what are success rates? Depending, of course,
Success
how you
rates are all
define
right.
success, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the problem is that most narcissists would never take therapy.
Mm,
They would never take therapy. They never come to you.
Mm-hmm.
They never do. Even if they come to you, they probably come to you for a completely different reason. For instance, a narcissist might have had some problems that had them depression, so they are now depressed, and they're here for depression. They're not here for
mm,
narcissistic personality disorder. And as soon as their depression is cured, they're not coming back anymore. It's over.
mm,
So the treatment is not usually successful because they do not stick around long enough to be cured. Or cure is probably impossible, but the idea is even to be treated, they usually do not stick around.
mm,
They do
mm,
not care to be treated. That's the problem.
mm. Interesting.
They'll never come back. And as soon as they feel like you seem to think you are better than them, it's over. They think you're not good enough.
Mm,
Because even in order to be listened to, you go and tell them something. You tell them you need to do this. They'll never do it because they think they are stupid, that you shouldn't be here in the first place. So it's
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate, but most treatments are not successful for narcissists. Most often, these people never come back. So if they never come back, you cannot treat them. And if they come back, and this is very exceptional, the treatment is all right. It can succeed, but it does not often succeed. It's
mm.
very unlikely that it will.
Now
So,
you
yeah.
said there's a dopamine component to NPD, right?
Yeah, dopamine signaling dysregulation, yes.
So is there treatment for that particular part of it that is, can affect the dopamine levels or?
I'm not quite sure. That's a question for a psychiatrist. I don't know much
Mm,
about it as far as
interesting.
that is concerned.
Okay. Well, we've been going for a good bit now. I
Yeah.
mean, I could go longer, but I want to be conscious of your time, of every, are you, do you want to keep going for a little bit or, what's your time look like?
At least for a little bit, yeah, sure, a little bit.
All
Why
right.
not?
Don or Anas, do you have any questions? I could read through Casey's stuff here too. They put some stuff up here.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have one question. How to distinct between someone who plays the narcissistic behavior from the genuine one who has this disorder?
Okay. How to differentiate between people who display certain traits and people who just have a disorder, right? Is that the question? Have I got it right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Mm.
Um, it is always a matter of levels, right? The extent to which they display certain traits, certain symptoms, right? A person who has a grandiose sense of self is not necessarily narcissistic in the sense of the disorder because they just happen to think they're better than others. But now imagine that this person tries to exploit you, use you in some way, harm you in society, or tries to demean you, humiliate you. So more often than not, the main characteristic that could tell you that this person is not necessarily suffering from the narcissistic personality disorder is that this person might think they are better, but they do not necessarily undermine you in any capacity, do not necessarily demean you. So if they have certain tendencies that might be described as narcissistic, but as long as they do not ridicule you, do not try to bring you down to their level, or do not try to make you feel terrible. You could possibly bet on the fact that they usually just have certain narcissistic traits, but are not necessarily people who are diagnosed with the disorder or who could be diagnosed with the disorder. Yeah, that's the answer to that question. It is all about certain behaviors and also the frequency of it. All people could perform such behaviors, but if it's too frequent and they do that indiscriminately, if there is no discrimination whatsoever, the behavior is performed and performed indiscriminately. They do not care whether you are somebody close to them or you are an enemy or something, because people do behave in terrible ways with some people because they dislike them. But if they do that indiscriminately, especially nearly indiscriminately, then you could pretty much bet on the fact that they are in some way, shape, or form pathological. It might not necessarily be narcissistic personality disorder. It could also be antisocial personality disorder, and this becomes more difficult to tell apart. But yes, yes, that's the answer.
So when did the classification, if you can hear me, when did the classification of narcissism start as a diagnosis? Do you know that?
Oh, I think I've read it. Let me check though. I'd like to confirm this. This question is very specific.
Hmm. While you're looking it up, I had other, like, I was thinking earlier just about older characters in history, Marcus Aurelius, Plato, Socrates, Rene
Mhm.
Descartes, Hume, Nietzsche, Camus. I mean, you think about all these historical figures. I sit and wonder to myself, like, once we started diagnosing traits and characteristics of narcissism, I wonder how many of them we reflected backwards and said, you know what, reading this person's writings, they were probably narcissistic. I mean, are there any stories like that stand out in your mind of historical figures that maybe were great at one point in time? I mean, look like Alexander the Great, for instance. You know, are there narcissistic qualities there, or is that someone who might be diagnosed today? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? If not the other question of the one that I just asked previously too. So
Mhm. Um, Possibility of a historical figure being narcissistic. Okay, so there are plenty of figures that I could think of off the top of my head that could be narcissistic, particularly. The problem is that history is quite riddled with misrepresentations, and history is often written by the victor. This notion is always true. So you can tell whether this is the actual story or this is something made up or this is something exaggerated to some degree. So you could, of course, make a diagnosis, possible diagnosis, not necessarily a fixed diagnosis of
Sure,
something.
sure.
The problem is that you don't know how well could you possibly trust those historical records of
Yeah,
those people,
true.
right?
But I mean, like
So
figures like
especially
Henry
pertaining
the
to their
Oh,
Eighth.
personality.
Henry VIII, for instance,
Hmm,
he was probably a malignant
hmm.
narcissist, but his environment probably catered to him being that way, in a sense, I
I
would
was
say.
about to say, yeah, like if you're in an environment where you are literally raised as the king and an extension of God,
Yeah.
like I've heard that differentiation with like Kanye is another example where some people have kind of speculated, like we don't want to necessarily like diagnose from afar, but
Sure.
because he's had this environment, because he does have a lot of talent, things like that, we might not, we'd have to look at all the other behaviors and symptoms associated, right?
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not looking to
it's
diagnose people. I'm just curious. I wonder. I just wonder about things. I wonder if we ever hit a
Yeah.
point where we were like diagnosing this thing and we're like, you know what? This person that we
Oh
thought
yeah.
was great then was just a malignant freaking narcissist, you know? I mean,
Oh
so,
yeah, I'd be curious too because I can't think of anybody off the top of my head.
mm.
But
I mean, well, yeah, once
that's
again, there are probably numerous historical figures that I think we could align characteristic traits with. Again, we can't diagnose them, but
yeah.
yeah. And did
who
you
are
At
the
the
like
find?
tip
the
of
top
many.
people that you would think of though?
Well, I mean, I would start. I would just start currently. Honestly, I'd look at public figures right now. Like, all right. So here you go. Uh, Trump, right? Trump is, in my opinion, would you call him? Do you think he's narcissistic? Let's ask that question. Do you think he's
Narcissistic.
diagnosable?
That's impossible to tell. I mean, I do not think so, and honestly. I don't
No.
think he's narcissistic per se. At least not in the not as defined in the DSM, no.
Mm,
He
mm,
definitely has some behaviors that could be described as narcissistic. Does he have all the symptoms that could be enough to diagnose narcissism? That's very difficult to tell, honestly.
mm,
But he does
mm,
portray some behaviors that are characteristically narcissistic. I could say so.
mm,
But I
mm,
don't know if it could be diagnosed. That's a little too far, in my opinion. At least not right now. If I met him, if I had had the option to perform certain tests on him, I might have a different opinion. But unless I actually interact with the
Hmm.
individual, it becomes difficult. And I could say so about another American politician. I'd say that,
Hmm.
you know what, and this might seem a little off the roof, but I also say that, you know what, you could easily argue the same for Barack Obama. And
yeah.
this is a problem, right? So
Right.
so so it's very difficult. And I'd say this could be argued for many politicians across the world, for that matter, that they are
Hmm.
narcissistic because they also have to be. Okay, let me get to
Confident.
this.
Yeah.
Right, this is interesting. Yeah, they have to showcase themselves as confident and even
Mm,
sometimes so good that everybody. I can't really tell whether they are doing this out of favors, out of necessity, so to speak. Is it expedient for them to act that way, or is it something that they genuinely do because they are that way? I don't know. So that's the problem. That's the same
This
problem
is
I have with Donald Trump. And I watched one of his interviews from a long time ago, and I was watching that, and I realized that he sounded very different in that video. He sounds very different. He doesn't sound as arrogant as he does right now. And the thing is that now it becomes very difficult. Now you have two videos of of him after becoming a politician, one of him before becoming a politician. Now, once you stand there and you think about it, it becomes extremely difficult to tell whether this person is narcissistic or not. Was he lying at the time, or was he lying? Is he lying right now? I don't know. I never know.
yeah.
That's
Could
the thing.
you tell could you tell us about the tests that you previously mentioned? What type of test you'd be able to conduct?
So there are plenty of tests for this, right? There are certain personality inventories that I could apply. I'd probably go for certain personality inventories first of all before I go and apply the narcissistic trait inventory. Of course, this differs from a person to person, right? But at the end of the day, so there are multiple personality inventories, right? So one of which is indeed the 16PF test, or certain other, what is it, Big Five test, and all of these traits do not test for personality disorders, but they test for personality traits. And if I see a particular personality trait being exaggerated in that individual, if I see that, okay, this is too high, why is that? This doesn't make any sense. Then you could use certain other screening tests there are. And then after that, you could use tests pertaining to narcissistic personality disorder or something of the sort. So this is a long process. So you have to use certain tests as required, right? So you have to start with a particular set of tests, and then you use certain screening tests, and then you finally come to diagnostic tests. And even diagnostic tests are not good enough. You also have to make observation or use checklists. There is something called the narcissistic personality checklist, right? You could use that checklist, and you could check all the behaviors that match and all the behaviors that do not match. And you could do the same for, there's something called the psychopathy checklist, I think it is called, and or antisocial checklist, and you could use those as well. So depending on the disorder and depending on certain behavior, certain personality traits, certain screening tests being applied, you could make a diagnosis. It's a long process if it's done right. Of course, I could, come up and say, okay, this person has this disorder, but it takes a long time.
And Casey said
Would you
here,
agree?
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Casey said that the traits and behaviors have to be stable over a period of time. They said 6 months. Is that right, or so?
These have to be stable over at least 6 months. It depends on the test, not necessarily for all traits. Like it depends on the kind of test that I'm performing. Yeah.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Like
Sorry.
this is
Oh,
this is one of the categories, but not for all.
gotcha.
Um, would you agree that in the last
Mm,
10 years,
mm,
the
mm.
rates for narcissism have risen at a substantial amount? Because I feel like this lately, it's running rampant. It's thriving. It's from before. I feel a huge shift. It was more closeted, and it wasn't as as verbose as it is now. Would you agree?
Okay. Now it seems that way on first impression. It definitely seems that way prima facie, but I couldn't necessarily make a objective statement about it. It could easily be the case that people are more likely to be diagnosed with such disorders nowadays because of the fact that psychotherapy and psychology has been extended and people have more access to it. And yes, there is also an element of political polarization right now. And this political polarization also peddles certain propagandistic behaviors and thought processes that have been spread across the board, right? And you could see the reflection of it across the world right now, not only in any specific country, it is happening across the world. That there's this polarization in politics that's led to people expressing themselves in what I describe as pathological manners, right? That's true. There's no doubt about it. But I don't know if that is just a reflection of the political climate or if it is something necessarily indicative of a disorder. Right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Casey, did you have something? So, I,
I'm just
oh,
agreeing.
oh, okay. Yeah. No, shoot, now I just lost what I was going to say. Um, sorry, somebody save me. I just lost my total train of thought.
I did have a question from earlier that I'm curious what you think, Heracles. As far as like you were saying for the narcissists when they go in for treatment, like I agree, it seems to be a lot of cases that they'll go in for a few sessions, and that's pretty typical for a lot of people. Like therapy isn't the most common for people to go for. First of all, access is difficult, but then I also wonder about the stigma associated. So if somebody goes in for treatment and a therapist isn't like aware of the treatment for narcissism and how to like navigate and try to keep them, if they're aware and start to pick up on those traits and try to suggest, oh, this could be like a long-term thing that we might want to work on. But they might have that idea of like, oh, well, I can't treat you, I can't cure you, so I'm not even going to try, kind of a thing. Does that make sense?
So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I get that. Of course, there's an enormous stigma associated with psychology, psychotherapy, especially especially in the developing world, I'd say. Of course, it's also true for the developed world, but it's also specifically true for the developing world. And this problem is an enormous problem across the board. And this is also possible that a therapist might think that this person is not going to be cured or not is not going to be treated well, and they might just not care about it whatsoever and simply give up on therapy. This could happen. It is unethical to do so, but it could happen. It does happen. I wouldn't say that it could happen. I've seen it happen. So I'll tell you the truth. It happens. It happens very often that people just do not care about certain patients, certain clients. They just do not care. And they just let them be as they are. And this could also contribute to the fact that just because you do not care about them, they might never come back, and this becomes essentially a cycle, an unending cycle at that. So, this is a problem. And I don't know how to solve that, but yeah, that's a genuine concern.
I, if I may, I apologize for being late. I did not set my alarm, so I missed the first half of the conversation, and I'm curious if you gave the audience clear distinctions, whether, like, what does high self-esteem and confidence look like versus um, narcissistic personality disorder. Have you went down the list of the examples or no?
Actually did, but okay. Okay.
Okay,
As
okay.
I said,
Then I have another question. If you already did, I'll have to watch the video when it comes out. Um, with with NPD, because I don't feel like saying all of that all over again. If it's actually officially diagnosed, what what challenges, I guess you could say, arise in identifying it accurately? And would you also, um, do you have anything to say about the persons that actually help mold these narcissists, like the parents and the family structures? Like, wanted to get your insight on that as well. Because I
hmm,
feel like,
that's
in particular, I'm speaking from personal lived experience, which I have quite unfortunately a bit of. Um, there, it, it seems to me, in my experience, that this person that I'm thinking of, their mother was a narcissist, and because of such narcissism, the other family, the surrounding family, lived in fear to step up to it, to put an end to it, to no longer um, deal with it. Like, I just I feel like it just kept growing, and when it could have been lessened, it was it was in perfect environment for it to thrive, um, because nobody stood up to it. Does that make sense?
mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Of course, as I said, that there are certain facilitators of narcissistic personality disorder, and the parents, the family, the peer group could facilitate the development of certain disorders, and especially if the child happens to be vulnerable to such disorders due to certain genetic predisposition. In these scenarios, it becomes increasingly difficult to tell what kind of parenting could prevent such a problem. But in general, what's seen across the board is that authoritative parenting style, and this is a particular parenting style defined as some kind of a parenting style where people do punish, but do not punish excessively, and they give their children enough freedom to express themselves, to express their thoughts, enough freedom to excel. At the same time, controlling them enough that they do not go too far with it. So this is considered kind of a balanced approach to parenting. And this is usually the best for children across the board. And if not this, permissive parenting style is often good. So if you let a child explore themselves and you're not getting in his way too much, that might actually reduce the chances of your child having a disorder. And this is true across the board, not only for narcissistic personality disorder, this is true across the board for all personality disorder, then as a matter of fact, for all disorders, right? So it and so if you happen to have a child, and I don't know, most parents would never know if their child happens to have certain genetic predisposition to certain disorders. But if you happen to have a child that has such a predisposition and you know it, you probably won't, but let's say you do. So the best thing that you could do to that child is that you do not degrade them too much. You do not degrade them too much, and you do not praise them too much either. You keep a level ground there. You praise them wherever they do the right thing, and you also criticize them wherever they do the right thing, and do not do so long enough, and do not do so repeatedly. If you have punished the child, do not punish them twice, right? You know, there's this
Hmm.
idea of double jeopardy in law. The same sort of a thing applies to life. Do not do that to your child. Do not punish a child twice. Do not praise the child or do not reward the child twice. Do not do it. Keep it limited and keep it as simple as possible. Do not make it complicated for the child that she does not understand what you're going to do. Do not be unpredictable as a parent. That's the worst thing that you could do to a child, that you are too unpredictable and a child can't really tell what you would do, how you would react. A child should be able to tell how you would react. A child should know that, okay, if I do this wrong thing, my parents might, punish me by not letting me watch TV, for instance, now by not letting me have my iPad or anything of the sort. The child needs to know that, but child also needs to know that the parent couldn't necessarily beat them up, right? Child
Hmm.
doesn't need is too scared. There's this balance, and this balance has to be found if you want to facilitate the best childhood for a child. And those parents who do the wrong things, as to those parents, they also have had their own problems in their lives. They also were at one point or another a victim of similar life, right? So I know they are perpetrators, but they're also victims. And we must look at them in that manner as well, that, okay, this person is expressing their own trauma in some sense of the word, right? So
Hmm.
be empathetic to them, but you also have to be assertive when you tell them this is wrong, this is not right, you shouldn't do that to your child. That sort of a thing. It's difficult. It's very difficult. Everything is, but yeah.
Casey said, would it be associated with avoidant traits with the stranger experiment early on?
I don't think I understand the question.
Hmm.
So not necessarily like a surefire example, but I think, is it the stranger experiment where you have like the kids with, if they react certain ways to their parents by like 2 or 3 years old, if the parent leaves the room and then comes back, depending on how the kid reacts, it would be, you've got the avoidant, preoccupied, disorganized, or secure attachment, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. We call it strange situation, but yeah, I got your point. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, these attachment styles were developed. Yes. Oh, of course, that's a part of it. Yeah. For narcissistic child, is it necessary that they have the avoidant style of attachment? Not necessarily. Is it more likely for them to have it? Yes.
Interesting.
Some they could have completely secure attachment style, as a matter of fact, because they have such high levels of narcissism that do not care that their mother isn't there in the first place. It doesn't really matter to them. But now the child usually does not have it. So the child might not necessarily have narcissism, but they might have actually a secure attachment style, which is quite counterintuitive, but it could be true. So it is not necessarily true for NPD that you have to have a particular style of attachment, the insecure style of attachment, right? Not necessarily.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. So we went into parenting. Anything else? I'm sorry. Anything else, Casey? Do you want to respond?
Oh, I was kind of piggybacking off of Kyle, so more so, yeah, if Kyle is thinking of anything along those lines either.
Kyle? Nothing. Yeah.
Um, no. I got a cough. Sorry.
No worries. Canaman Don, you haven't said anything. You have any questions? No? You can pop in if you do. Anyways, we went to parenting style. You went to parenting styles, Heracles. I know of a couple of them. You talked about a few of them. One was permissive. One was authoritative. There's also authoritarian, right?
Yeah.
And so are there parenting styles that are more likely to lead to, that have correlations to narcissistic behaviors, or?
Mm, um. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not aware of a study about that. If there is any, I just don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so.
Yeah, because
I
I would
mean, there
think.
might be a case to be made for one or the other, but I don't know about any studies that
Mm,
have been conducted for the same.
I don't know. It would make sense to me that like an authoritarian parenting style might have a tendency to lead to a child to, you know, but I don't know. That's, speculative at this point. Um, Interesting though.
Possibly, I might have to look into the studies on that matter. I don't know. I'd
Mm,
have to check.
mm. Anything else you want to cover today? Do you want to keep going? Um,
I don't know. I think I've done enough for today. I think we have had a quite long conversation.
yeah,
And
yeah. It was good
yeah.
though. It was really interesting.
Actually, yeah, actually, I have a question for Casey. You asked me about those 6 months, right? You said like these traits have to be present for 6 months. Were you talking about the DSM-5? Is that what you're saying? Because I think I might have misunderstood your question there. Wait a second. What did you say about that?
Yeah,
What did you mean?
yeah, I'm trying to, because I've got a copy of it, so I was looking over to see if that is one of the requirements for the diagnosis. But I thought that was for personality disorders in general, that when you're going to observe it, yeah, you'd need like the 6 months of the stable traits associated with it or
Stable traits.
symptoms.
Oh yeah, so okay, in that case, the answer would have been completely different because I thought you were asking me that how long does these traits have to be present for it to appear on screening or something of the sort. Okay, so you were asking about DSM. Okay, okay. In that case, you're quite, yeah, that's right. You have to have them for 6 months. That's right.
Mm.
But usually it's not only about 6 months, it's usually about lifelong. You should have had them before even your adulthood. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, with the personality disorder, you would think that, yeah, the personality will be stable over time.
Hmm.
I do have one question, if you would humor me, Hercules. I really appreciate you going over this subject. Um, if you don't mind me asking,
Yeah, go ahead.
can you give the audience and us some
Hmm.
pointers on how we can, I guess, work together, be proactive to shift
Hmm.
this culture away from, I guess you would call it performative narcissism, and and changing it to more authentically emotionally intelligent, um, like content creators. I mean, after all, this is going to be platformed on YouTube. um,
Hmm. About, because this is a rather interesting question. It is difficult to do so. I mean, it lies with the audience really, because if you want better content at any place, what you need to do is you need to choose better content. So it becomes very difficult to say that, you know what, you need to get content creators for it. No, it's not. So I'd say that widespread awareness about things, widespread awareness about how you could be misled, how you could have different opinions from different people, especially ill-informed opinions from people who do not know anything about such things, right? There are plenty of people lying off the top of their head all the time on social media. So you have to be very careful about that. So I'd say that the first thing that you should do is psychoeducate or educate people about disorders, the importance of psychology, uh, uh, importance of professional opinion instead of just any person who's giving opinion. A layman's opinion is not the same as a professional opinion on these matters. Of course, some people could be very educated. There are exceptions to the rule who might be very educated about psychology, but generally, a layman doesn't know enough about psychology to speak of it. And you have to be cautious whom you are speaking to and how much that person knows about the subject that they speak of. So I think just being cautious, just being critical enough to question what's being said to you, and even question me for that matter, because I might get something wrong. I'm a human being, everybody is. So even question the opinions of professionals, but do so in a scientific and critical manner instead of just doing so in what I'd consider a controversial manner, right? So that's all I'd have to say about that. Just being critical and conscious about what you are consuming and what you are thinking. That's all you could do at the end of the day, and being more aware and spreading that awareness across the board. Just not good enough to be aware. Sometimes it's also important to make people aware about things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
I think I think it's important to to not to not ignore the signs, because we have a responsibility um, to engage with that type of behavior and that type of, how do I say this? There's content creators that purposely make content that is that makes that makes narcissism like thrive. Like they're treated with like the silver spoon. You know, they get the mic, they get, it's all the cringe worthy stuff that I feel just amplifies it. Does it make sense?
It does, it does. Mhm. There's, I suppose there has been an increase in questionable content across the board on all social medias. There's no exception really. But it is a part of the problem. But I'll tell you something. You could not possibly post such content and have people just believe in it unless they're uneducated, unless they do not know enough. Let me ask you a question. If you're educated enough, if you know everything about those things, if you know what's happening across the board, you could pay attention to it and you could realize, you know what, this guy is just, deliberately messing with us. This guy is promoting a terrible agenda, and you shouldn't really buy into that. So I do agree that these people shouldn't post such things, but I can always tell you that the only thing that you could really care about is how you respond to such content. So I'd say that from a personal perspective, and this is more of my personal opinion, not necessarily a professional opinion, but I say that what all of us should do in this scenario is to be cautious of what we say and how we respond to such information, how we respond to misinformation. We must also address any misinformation wherever possible. But if you think that somebody's got something right and you got something wrong, you should also be humble enough to acknowledge, you know what? I think this is one thing that you're saying that's right. You might be all wrong about everything else, but this particular thing, I think you're right, and I am wrong, and I accept that. So sometimes showing a little bit of humility might also encourage the other person to be humble as well. They might also come to understand that, you know what, they might be wrong as well. So, being humble enough to acknowledge our own mistakes sometimes plays a role. So I say that when you encounter people who do not necessarily acknowledge their mistakes or who promote narcissistic agendas, just be exactly the opposite. Be who you ought to be. Be precise, be right, and whenever you're wrong, be humble enough to acknowledge it. And this is all I could say about it. I don't think there is a better solution. Everything is, it's going to be slow, but it's going to happen.
that's pretty much what I was thinking because I did kind of want to respond if that's okay too, as far as like, because you touched on all the boundaries that we can hold for ourselves. And I also like, it just got me thinking about some of the methods I've heard for treatment for the narcissist. Like, if you have to engage with somebody, having the boundaries for yourself to like acknowledge what you're going to engage with and what not. But if they, because I think part of treatment is like recognizing that they have low self-esteem. And so recognizing when they do things right, it's kind of counterintuitive because you would think that, oh, we don't want to prop them up and feed into their ego. But that actually is like a good thing to do for anybody. You know, if somebody's doing something good, you say thank you for that, right? I mean, you don't have to. And that's, again, going back to that boundary, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. You sometimes have to be humble before those who are trying to be deliberately malignant or arrogant. Because you have to be right. It doesn't really matter how they are. You shouldn't mirror them because at that point it matters little that you are being right because you are acting as they are. I think that's a problem many people face because when they encounter people like that and they think these people are too arrogant, you become so dissatisfied with them, perhaps so frustrated with them that you just simply oppose whatever they say. But then that also undermines your position. That also undermines you as a person. You shouldn't do that. If they have something right to say, if you find yourself in error about something, you know what, I'm wrong. And I accept that. And I accept that I might have said something wrong today. And I want to start with myself that I might have said something wrong today. And if you guys see it on the video, correct me in the comments. And I wherever I think you are right, I'll acknowledge it. Thank you. And that I'll say.
Agree. Humility goes a long way. Fallibility, the ability to admit when we're wrong and we don't know everything. Totally agree. As far as content is concerned, somebody mentioned content. I'm like, we also have our own choices. You know, we can choose not to engage with or to disengage from or to not acknowledge people who we believe show those types of characteristics, even if their content is necessarily good, I guess, because you know, I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about that? I mean, let's say they're creating great content, but we know that they're, like you hear about movie stars behind the scenes who are like they had all this long history of great movies released, and then afterwards you hear about how horrible of people they were behind the scenes. Is that worth it?
I mean, separating the art from the artist. I don't know if it is true that these people happen to be horrible, and by watching their content, you promote horribleness. I might think that it's okay for you to boycott, it's okay for you to abstain from such content. On the other hand, I also think it depends on the kind of content that you speak of. For instance, you just spoke about Hollywood. In that case, I'd say, yeah, fine. If you do not want to watch their movies, fine, do not watch it. But let me ask you another question. How about the fact that there are multiple actors in the movie? How about the fact that there are directors, there are other people involved who might be worse off if you do not watch it? So, is it important to benefit? Is it important to punish certain people even if you punish some innocent along with it? Is it something that you think of? If you do, then I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer, really. You could have multiple opinions about it.
Yeah.
I'd say that it's your choice. You have the right to do it. I would not advise anybody to do it, or not to do it for that matter. I wouldn't advise anyway.
Well, I mean, it comes down to personal choice, I think. But yeah, just by the sole fact that one participant in some creation has malignant behavior. I mean, I've definitely seen people get deplatformed because they have behavior, and that platform has casualties beyond just themselves. You know. Um, so yeah, I don't. But I think you're right. There's no right or wrong there necessarily. It's just a personal choice. So if you
I
believe,
forgot.
sorry, go ahead, Casey.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say if you believe that something is harmful, then it should be your personal choice to just disengage, not engage, not acknowledge, yada yada yada. So go ahead, Casey.
I forgot. 'Cause I was going to respond to that, but then because it was just making me think of like the unconditional positive regard. I mean, Alex mentioned that on last week's show, on his show, and just in general, like kind of what Heracles was saying about all these other people involved on top of, yeah, if you're watching any other content or part of these communities. And then, yeah, when it comes to a person, if you're picking up on a lot of those traits, like, yeah, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself with the boundaries thing of, but yeah, because you can still recognize that most people, even narcissists, are not going to be like, what are the other there's like the antisocial masochistic or um like the dark tetrad traits. Like that's such a
Sadism,
rare
sadistic.
case. But for the people that are just narcissistic and maybe have some like comorbidities with some other issues, but yeah, just being able to say like I don't want to engage with this right now and I'll pick up later, and just being able to recognize when you're going into that space yourself. Like yeah, everything you said is yeah, on point.
Yeah, I think boundaries are hugely important. Something I think a lot of people don't have good grasp on. Too many people, maybe. Maybe that's part of the problem. The overt message is set your boundaries, and if somebody's a narcissist, don't be around them.
Yeah,
That
for
makes
sure.
sense.
Right.
Absolutely.
Heracles, anything else, man?
Well, I could speak about the types of narcissistic personality disorder, although it is not used in the DSM. I don't know. Is it something I should speak of? I don't think so.
If you have the energy, go for it.
It's not in the DSM. It's something that's used in some researches. I don't know if it could be considered official, but I could speak of it if you want me to. Okay, let me go ahead with it. So there are times in the DSM. I'd like to emphasize that it's not a technical category, but it's been used based on the kinds of symptoms that are diagnosed, right? So the grandiose narcissist, the idea that these people just focus on grandiosity, the main trait, the idea of vulnerable narcissist. The vulnerable narcissists are those that do not have grandiose thinking. These people are just vulnerable to criticism. They just hate being criticized. They just hate that somebody looks down upon them. They just show yes enormous hate because they feel like everybody is just out to get them. This is usually very different from the narcissistic person that you think of. Because in this case, what ends up happening is that this so there has been a study in 2011 by Miller in which these sorts of narcissists actually showed low self-esteem instead of high self-esteem, which is quite exceptional because more often than not, narcissistic people you think high self-esteem, but this is one of the counter examples that you would come up with. The idea that there's this group of people that have completely opposite symptoms, right? So these people have low self-esteem. This is an exceptional case, although this is not usually the most common kind of narcissist that you'd encounter. And if you even encounter such a person, you probably can't even tell. I spoke about the idea that there are certain narcissists you can't really tell that they are narcissists because they do have it. You can't really tell. You meet them, you don't think they're narcissistic. You might think that they're too emotional for that matter. So you come up with these people and you tell them, you know what, you're doing this wrong. You could, perhaps fix it. And they're like, how dare you tell me that? Why are you here? Get lost. So that sort of a thing, right? So this sort of a narcissist does exist according to some categories that have been used in the past, but I don't know if this category should be used or not. This is something I don't know because this is not a technical category in the DSM. But yeah, I spoke about it nevertheless because it's something I think I should, get it over with. So yeah.
I've heard some good examples to kind of differentiate those. You've got the type of narcissism from the main character in There Will Be Blood with Daniel. Um, and then differentiating that from Matt Damon's character in The Talented Mr. Ripley. I think the latter being more of that example of the vulnerable narcissist. But I think it's interesting to think about that, like, based on the behaviors that we see, there will be the people that are less likely to display that type of symptom of grandiosity, even though it's there. Like they're just thinking it, but they're not saying it out loud, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was getting at when she spoke about grandiosity and how I emphasized that as probably the classic characteristic of narcissism. The idea that even though they do not want to say it, even I think that is also a part of why are not often diagnosed with the first symptom. The person might not be diagnosed with the first symptom of grandiose self-esteem because, or what is it? What was the exact word for it? I do not want to get it wrong. Wait a second. Because I do not want to get the word wrong in the DSM. It's grandiose sense of self-importance. A person might still have it and not be diagnosed with it. Why? Because they hate to be criticized. Since they hate to be criticized so much that they cannot bother to think that For instance, a person, they might come up to somebody and tell them that they are the best, and the other person tells them that they are not. There's so much they hate the fact that somebody could tell them that they are not the best that they wouldn't even say it. That's why they cannot be diagnosed with it, because they do not say it, because they do not want to be criticized. It's a cycle. But that does not mean they do not believe it. They believe it. But since they believe it and they also do not want to be criticized for it, they wouldn't tell you that they believe it. So I think it's still a foundational trait. It's something that's just not seen in some people because they would not necessarily
Oh, we lost your voice, Heracles. Hello? Is anybody else there?
Yeah, yeah, he faded out for me too.
Hmm. So I was wondering, I was thinking in my head, Dan Dan, did you have something you wanted to say?
I've just been listening and I just jumped in. I just want to know there. It's not impossible to diagnose a narcissist. Just like any other diagnoses, some things are harder to diagnose than others. There's also medical issues, biological issues that are also difficult to diagnose. And it's just this is the nature of the disorder.
Yeah. I think Heracles was saying sometimes it's impossible, not all the time. Or it could be
It's
it
just a
could be
difficult thing
really
to
hard.
diagnose.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we
yeah.
kind of touched on it earlier that it's like there's just like a cycle of issues that like they might be less likely to go in for treatment, and then when they do, are they treated a certain way that makes them not continue treatment? Like, yeah.
Mm, mm. Sorry, Heracles, you kind of dropped off there.
Yeah, I somehow got disconnected. I don't know, some technical error, I suppose. Yeah. Uh, so yeah, I was just saying that you could simply have all of these things. You could have the grandiose sense of self, and yet it might not be displayed because you are not willing to express it because you do not want to be criticized. So the unwillingness to be criticized renders you uh, essentially inhibitive or perhaps reserved about expressing your grandiose self-esteem or grandiose idea of self. You just do
Mm,
not express it. You cannot express it because you do not want to be criticized. That's the thing I was getting at.
yeah,
So I still
yeah.
think even in those disorders, even in those diagnoses in which the person is not necessarily diagnosed with the first symptom, even in those diagnoses, it is present. It's just that it is not expressed. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I think that's the case for most diagnoses. There might be exceptions. I'm not saying that this is universally true, but I still think this is mostly true.
Mm, mm. Casey, Dan Dan.
Yes.
I missed
And
something. Was I asked a question?
no, I was just seeing if you guys had anything to say. Um, anyways, I was thinking about with the vulnerable narcissist. I was thinking about Gollum or Schmeagol from the Lord of the Rings. Would that be a good example of a vulnerable narcissist? Someone who can't really outwardly express, you know, their desire and their belief in themselves being the thing, but I don't know. My brain went there when I was thinking of a good example of a vulnerable narcissist.
Uh, the unfortunate part is that I'm not acquainted with either of those characters.
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
don't really speak. I can't
I,
really speak about them. So,
mm, I thought maybe Casey or Don Don might also, but anyways,
I've never heard about vulnerable narcissism. I haven't researched narcissism too much.
mm,
Um, I think it's easier to spot. I think I can spot it in people once I spend enough time with them.
yeah,
But overall, I think that the saddest person is the narcissist. Usually, they're very sad people.
mm,
Have very
mm,
hard maintaining friendships, very hard maintaining relationships. Um,
mm,
so
mm. Interesting. So, well, Heracles, did you have anything else you wanted to cover?
I don't know. Okay, I'll add one thing that there have been some studies that indicated that they might have decreased gray matter in a particular part of their brain, particularly the left anterior insular cortex, right? So a particular part of the brain that is involved in emotional processing and self-awareness might have less gray matter. That is the soma of the cells. This is a particular kind of neuron. So, so what ends up happening is that they have less of it. They have fewer neurons in that particular part of the brain. So it
Mm,
might mean that it is less developed. So that could play a role. It is a correlation. You cannot possibly draw a causation here, but it is a correlation that's been seen in some studies. Well, the sample size wasn't as big as it needs to be, in my opinion. So I don't know to what degree I trust the results of the study, but it is there.
mm, interesting. Yeah, I mean, questions would, excuse me, come into my head about what could be circumstances that could lead to those pathologies necessarily. But yeah, if it's just correlative and not, it's just more information, nothing we can say positively. So, Canaman Don is back. Don, did you have any questions?
No, sorry, bud. I've been a little distracted for a while, and I've missed a good portion of last bit, so I'm not even sure where we're at.
No worries. Well, then I'm probably just going to wrap it up here, end the stream, and if we want, we can pop down. I mean, we can stay here. It doesn't matter. I just don't have to record. I'll just shut down the stream. So, unless anybody else has anything, I'm going to turn it off and sign off. Say sayonara. All right. Thank you for anybody who watches in the future. Thank you for everyone who participated, was involved. Herakles, again, thank you so much for your continued involvement and toleration of me.